Hello and welcome to a very special Nasher 360 event. I'm Curator of Education Anna Smith, and today we're happy to host a Modern Art Notes podcast conversation between Tyler Green and Charles Long. Charles Long's Fountainhead, on view at Northpark Center as part of the Nasher XChange exhibition, is a clever technological take on the form and function of traditional fountains. Visitors to Northpark are invited to donate money to 3 Dallas charities by tossing virtual coins into a font of flowing digital dollars. And if you haven't already, you should really go try it because it's pretty amazing. This synthesis of object, technology, and participant is characteristic of Long's work, which has included a collaboration with the London-based band Stereolab and the sensorial installation Pet Sounds in Madison Square Park. Long has been the subject of solo exhibitions at such institutions as the St. Louis Museum of Art, Site Santa Fe, the Hammer Museum Los Angeles, and his work is held in the collections of museums including the Whitney, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Hirshhorn. In addition, Long has been the recipient of numerous honors and awards, which include grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Pollock-Krasner Foundation, as well as the Award of Merit Medal for Sculpture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Interviewing Long this afternoon is Tyler Green, a Washington-based journalist who edits and writes Modern Art Notes and works as the U.S. columnist for Modern Painters magazine. Modern Art Notes has been described by the Wall Street Journal as the most influential of all visual arts blogs, and has been featured along with its creator in the New York Times, Time Magazine, the LA Times, and the Washington Post, which named Green one of 14 young and influential cultural figures. Today, Green joins us as part of his recent venture, the Modern Art Notes podcast, a weekly program featuring interviews with artists, curators, art historians, and authors. I'll let Tyler fill us in on the details for today's recording in just a moment, but first, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Charles Long and Tyler Green.
Charles Long, welcome to the Modern Art Notes podcast.
Hello. Thank you, Tyler.
Naturally, we're going to start with Fountainhead, the work you've made for Nasher XChange. Which came first, the conception of what the piece would be or the Ayn Rand reference?
Interesting. Probably the Ayn Rand reference. Things all come together sort of synergistically at the same time. I'm always researching, and so whatever I'm listening to or reading or looking at is all sort of floating in a kind of amorphous cloud, and then certain things drop in and they start to focus. And it was during the last presidential election that I was reminded of her as Paul Ryan was bringing her up, and he was making everybody read her book that worked in his office, that it was mandatory reading. I had read it when I was studying architecture, and I was a very impressionable young punk rocker, and I took it to heart and became kind of a jerk for about a month. My friends would ask me, to help them move or something. I'd be like, no, you have to do it yourself. Not carrying any milk crates up the stairs for you. But I do still respond to the sense of integrity that she brought to the aesthetic practice. That really stayed with me. But I found that the current political climate that we're in, where any sense of social equity is sort of deemed a kind of weakness, or this thing that we have to eradicate. And a lot of people point to her philosophy as an example of it, but she's a terrible example because she died on Medicaid and welfare. So I thought it was an interesting paradox. And then the other thing I found was that there was a wonderful architect in Dallas in the 60s who did swimming pools, and his company was called the Fountainhead. And so that kind of research started to flow together into this idea of generosity, but also perhaps I also was interested in the flip side too, of a kind of decadence. To make this fountain of money was somewhat tongue-in-cheek.
So for listeners who don't know the novel, as you suggested, it's kind of about how individualism trumps a societal group interest. And so the piece is installed at Northpark Center, a shopping mall, I don't know, about 5 miles north of downtown Dallas. I'm guessing that your idea of, for the piece, for the title, and the site were all happened at once. I'm guessing that was fundamental.
It was, and you know, I've been fortunate to have a nice history with the Nasher, going way back to '93, I think, when I came to the Northpark Center Mall, not knowing anything about Ray Nasher's collection. And I was really impressed by that kind of juxtaposition of very progressive art in a very, you know, middle-class kind of, you know, environment. I thought that was beautiful, that there wasn't any sort of, you know, special accommodating. It was like quite naturally installed in the mall. I thought that was fabulous.
And so some of the artists there are James Rosenquist, Mark DeSuvro, Joel Shapiro, Anthony Gormley, you, of course. There's a Frank Stella up right now, and a few others. So the piece includes this form onto which swirling dollar bills are projected. And then there's a social practice component to the piece. So I guess first, for people who haven't seen it yet, could you describe what that social practice component is and how it exists in the context of Tiffany and Victoria's Secret and Louis Vuitton? And
Right, I chose that, the South Court, which is also sort of their high-end market. I wanted to be surrounded with that kind of conspicuous consumption. And so that was important. And then I wanted a kind of golden calf experience as well, you know, for people to be sort of, you know, almost in worship of this, you know, fountain of money. So there was a play with that space and what are people doing in that space. And what I've learned in the public works that I've done is really the way I work with the public is as like another medium in my studio. I use them, if that's all right with everybody, I use them to my own ends. I don't think about facilitating their enjoyment, but I take their desire for it and I figure out how to incorporate it so that they're players with this object. So people come up to this glorious fountain. There's a soundtrack of very seductive, almost kind of close encounters of the third kind theme music that is bathing the space. And they come up to
it bathes the space in such an area from 40, 60, 80 feet away that it pulls you toward it, which is kind of part of the...
Right, and the mall frames it, the architecture of the mall frames it beautifully as you're coming up to it, so you see this thing and you're getting closer and it's kind of intense.
You kind of have to go up 2 small stairs as you approach them, yeah.
And so then there's, in a ring around it, there are some kiosks, and each kiosk is dedicated to a different charity. And when...
Plug the charities.
Right. Bookmarks, which is the Dallas Library that's at the mall. The, is it the North Dallas Food Bank?
And Public Advocates.
And, right. And yeah, CASA, which is court-appointed special attorneys for children. So I wanted them very local charities so that when people were giving, it was actually like immediate. Their money immediately goes into the accounts of those organizations, and then that is already available for them to use to help the community. So I wanted that feedback very quick.
Can I interrupt on that real quick? Were you consciously thinking of that being in contrast to the multinational retailers surrounding them, the local and the multinational?
Not really. Although, you know, and there were many possible tie-ins. I'm always open to working with different organizations, and I would have been even interested in working with those stores. They all have their own charities. So there was a moment where I was thinking, well, should we all work together on something? But then I realized it was important to really be connected more to the public. and have those stores be the backdrop, which is interesting too for me, that anybody that takes a picture of it and puts it up on Instagram, those stores are being advertised in the background.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. Maybe I should get a royalty.
So there are these kiosks, 3 kiosks, and you can swipe your credit card and choose a $1, a $3, or a $5 donation. And then what happens? What literally happens next?
A coin appears. It looks like a Liberty silver dollar.
On the kiosk screen.
On the kiosk. And then you can touch it and move it and fling it towards the space of the fountain. And then it appears flying through the air, projected on the sculpture. And once it impacts the flow of money, there's this big explosion, and yeah, dollar bills go flying, and there's swishing sounds, and it's a real fun moment for the public. Why
The form you chose for the physical sculptural element looks a little bit like a shopping bag, but not a lot like one. I mean, a very little bit like one. And I wonder why that form. I mean, you could have done a screen, you could have done something flat, vertical. Why this almost carved form?
It's pretty intuitive, the process of figuring out how I want to relate to the public. And presence and aura have always been, really kind of the touchstone of my practice. Ever since, being taught how to deconstruct aura, going way back to, being in, school and reading Walter Benjamin about aura. And I looked at it and I thought, you're never going to get rid of it, even though he was critiquing it. And I basically started to look at it. And so my work early on in school focused on the object. And it's almost as if the object, the possibility of an object is almost the core of my work. And it's throughout all the work. So what happens is, once I objectify a thing, then it presents all these opportunities for a kind of distension of that thing, where that thingness starts to fall apart and become a system or an organism that's integrated into other things. So it's an illusion, perhaps, or an unstable wholeness that I get interested in. So, like in Pet Sounds,
which was a piece you did last year at Madison Square Park in New York.
Right. So
a piece with these kind of anthropomorphic-ish forms that made noise and that people were encouraged to fondle.
Yeah. So, it's a system of railings that distend into these, blobs. For me, that's it's all of one thing, and even the railing itself is actually an extension of the earth. Like, the earth is an object, and the railing that is grounded into that object is actually an extension of it. But it's a place where humans can get a grip on the world. It's a handle for the world so that they can hang on. And then that railing distorts. It's not that it comes and hooks up to blobs. It is one and the same. And then those blobs have sensors in them. And when people pet them, they get all these different sounds out of it. So you can play them like a musical instrument. So that element is rewards the viewer's touch is actually something I use in order then to be sure that I have people attached to the blobs, because then the people are also now another blob in this extension of objects.
This kind of tactility and invitation of engagement of, I was going to say the viewer, but they're doing more than viewing, right? They're playing with them. You've been exploring for 10 or 12 years now, including with a piece you did called 100 Pounds of Clay that's been installed in a number of places. When did you first want to start encouraging the viewer to become the toucher, and why was that important? How did that start being important?
It came out of the project I did with the group Stereolab.
Musical group.
Yeah, and their music was a kind of bubblegum pop, but more synthetic, more space age. And listening to their music, I conceived of a project that was really about bodies and how bodies connect but are also isolated. So the project was called the Amorphous Body Study Center. And the centerpiece of it was the Bubblegum Station, which was a huge pile of pink clay that was both on top of a table and underneath a table, which was a way of talking about the amorphous body. Again, a kind of an object that is almost more of the mind than of the physical, but the physical was what the project was about. So the gum under the table is that repressed physicality that happens in the process of socialization of the child. The child is in class, they're listening, they're not supposed to be putting their hands in places that, it's supposed to be on top of the desk. Well, the gum comes out of the mouth and goes under the table and joins this social repressed body.
You did that as a kid? Yes?
Absolutely. And I was fascinated by the world that I found under that desk first, before I looked and I'm like, wow, that's not on this top shiny formica wood-grained surface. That's this other thing. But I grew up in a ceramics pottery business. And so clay was in the house, and there weren't really any boundaries. Like we made ceramics in the kitchen, and then when it was dinner time, my mom would roll the clay out, and she'd put a chicken on the clay, put on some spices, and wrap the clay up around it into the shape of a chicken, and put it in the oven and bake it. And then we'd take it out, hit it with a hammer, have this great peasant chicken, and eat it on plates that we had made that had pictures of chickens on them. So the creative process for me actually already was very much a continuum. But I saw, as I was being socialized as a child, that I resisted, proper socialization. I was a bit of a juvenile delinquent. And it was really art that was the thing that rescued it from being totally antisocial. It was in art class where the, amorphous body under the table comes out and is on top of the table, and is also a joint activity with other people. It becomes a way of communicating with people, not necessarily through words. You can talk while you do it, but that's not necessarily what's actually going on. There's a joint physicality, and there's the plasticity in clay where it retains a shape, and therefore is that's the physicality, and yet it has the potential for movement and change.
So with the 100 pounds of clay pieces, there's a large wall, and there are these little cubes of clay, on day one of the show anyway. There are these little cubes of clay, and visitors are encouraged to walk up to the wall, take hold of a piece of clay, make it into anything they want. And so one of the things I love about art, because I'm a bit of an antisocial nerd myself, is that you can go have a moment with an object that doesn't require any other human interaction. You're just with that thing in front of you. So is that part of what you were after in the mix of your kind of juvenile delinquency with giving people the opportunity to have this moment where they don't have to communicate with anything but the inanimate?
That's right, and that's why there's sound in 100 pounds of clay, where I collaborate with different people, usually a local radio station or all the people that work in the museum. They curate a playlist that gets played in the installation. Or with Stereolab, they actually made music where you had to plug headphones into these blobs to listen to it. So the music is also another way of sort of holding and feeding the viewer what they may sort of somehow need. Like I find that there's I don't know, there's a predictability through rhythm that is comforting. And so in the process of working with the clay, things are being worked out that are in the unconscious. And what's also really important in these pieces is that, like in the Bubblegum Station, it begins just as a sphere, and in 100 pounds of clay, it begins as a block. What happens is, I see it as those objects then get peopled, that difference is made out of a wholeness. That wholeness has originally a kind of amorphous non-specificity, and then it is altered in such a distinct way, literally with fingerprints, but also with the imagination and what is coming up in the moment for that person. So that's always been an interest of mine, that, you know, I'm interested in the mystery of how people become who they are, and what is individuality, and what is personality, and what is character.
There isn't there's this au courant idea or practice in the art world now called social practice, where artists take what interests them from an artistic point of view and encourage communities to do things or have things or engage with them in a specific way. It almost sounds like the way you're describing 100 Pounds of Clay, which is a 13-year-old piece now, 2000 was the first one, that it may have served as like an entree to that idea for you in a way that really kind of blossoms with Fountainhead, and something we'll talk about later that you're working on for Austin. Mm-hmm. Is that maybe right?
Mm-hmm. Can you rephrase that?
Well, Fountainhead is very much a social practice work. It's the artist encouraging the community to do something and kind of giving them back something for it with when the money hits the fountain. And it almost sounds like in the 100 Pounds of Clay piece, people are getting something out of that too, but it's more kind of emotional or metaphysical than it is community practical in Fountainhead.
I guess I don't know quite how to answer that. I would say that all the different projects I do, I would say there's that strange process of going from my own imagination and my own, I would even say, perverse fascination with object and its sort of transformation, and that's very private. And then when it becomes public, that public part of it was something that grew out of that private thing, where I'm projecting what that experience is going to look like, but then it's out of my control. I mean, some of it is that it's, you know, I spend a lot of time alone. I live on a mountain.
Outside Los Angeles.
Yes, and so it is a very dramatic kind of shift from one thing to the other.
I'm also really interested in the shapes you use. I mean, the shapes in 100 Pounds of Clay other people are making and using. But we were talking about the Madison Square Park installation and these very bulbous shapes, the shape of the central object of Fountainhead is very distinct. You made a series of stoneware works in the mid-2000s. The shapes and object presences of these things are all massively different. Are you not interested in form, or do you have a very kind of Baroque, far-wandering interest in form?
Absolutely Baroque, in fact. Literally, in that this project with the stoneware, which was in 2006, it became a show that was called Soul Houses, Monads, and a Star-Off Machine. And monads, a monad is a concept that was developed by the Baroque philosopher Leibniz. And it's a beautiful, strange concept about objectness, or it sort of falls between object and idea. He invented the idea of the monad as something to try to resolve. Originally, he was trying to resolve the paradox of there being a perfect God and an imperfect world. And so he said that monads were neither things nor ideas, but something in between, and that there was an infinite number of them. They were all utterly individual, and that they all contained all the other ones, or in their surface somehow. So, and he worked it out mathematically. And I've been fascinated with the idea for many years, and it's now returning. I thought I was just kind of nuts and interested in it on a kind of surface level because I couldn't really make sense of it. But as it turns out, it's actually becoming useful again in this new philosophy that's being practiced in the last 10 years called object-oriented ontology. So for me, yes, it's that there is a thing. The form it takes is almost, it's really unknown. And, I think my life work is really just a ramble through all possible different variations of form.
Because you've made works in the last decade with forms that are reminiscent of Calder, Eero Saarinen, Bertoia. And do you think through, do you have a kind of a corkboard in your studio like many artists do where you keep a visual storehouse of images present, or is it much more organic in terms of how you think about shapes and form you might want to use?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny, it was that way, and as life gets longer, that pile of images has gotten so huge that it can't even be maintained. It's boxes and boxes of images that before it would be more focused.
So do you have like a tulip table in your house?
I don't have it in the house, but I have 7 of them in my studio. So.
Oh, really? Actual tulip table?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Actually, they're knockoffs.
Oh.
The tulip table has always fascinated me because when Saarinen made it, he talked about the table and tulip chair as, he said that the undercarriage of tables and chairs created for an ugly, confusing, and unproductive world. I wanted to clean up the slum of legs and make the table all of one thing again. That's basically a paraphrase of what he said. And it is that beautiful attempt in modernism to put the atom back in its container after it was exploded. With everything out, he brings it back in. And so that beautiful shape is that distension of wholeness. It's one thing. There's not really a leg and then a top. It's all of one thing. So I was interested in that, but I wanted to bring the repressed back out of his project and the repressed back out of modernism. So in a sense, undoing it and going backwards into surrealism. So with the Saarinen tables that I made, I mounted them on the wall. And so you would encounter them as, you would have that beautiful sense of wholeness, this big sort of planet orb floating in front of you. But as you came around to the side, it would reveal this chaos. But yet, everything that's there is all still all of one thing. It's just that the differentiation is so intense and specific that it's, could be disturbing, but also quite a wonderful fantasy as well to engage in.
These are one of my favorite things. I think they're both fun and funny. And before I realized there was an Eero Saarinen reference, I saw what I thought was a Bob Irwin disc. Mm-hmm. Is that intended, or did that just kind of happen once you started playing with that form and putting it on a wall?
Well, again, it's like that thing where I say all these things are floating in the air all at once. That research also involved looking at a lot of paintings, sort of like Bosch's musical Hell. He's interested in a lot of different ideas that people had about utopia and dystopia. So the research is very broad, and it takes a certain catalyst. And it was a funny catalyst that brought this project together. I had planned one idea for a booth that was up at the Armory through my gallery. And I presented the idea to her, and she said, it's a great project for down here in my space, because what you're interested in there will play well, but up there it will look very conservative, and they'll ask if you had died. And I was like, oh no, this is terrible. The show has to ship in a month, and here's my great idea down the drain. And I thought, oh, and I had to go out to get the Christmas tree and take care of errands, and I went upstairs, and I took off my studio clothes, and I put on my clothes to go shopping, and I put my pants on backwards. And I thought, what the heck? I'm going to keep going with this. And I put on all my clothes backwards. The shoes were on the opposite feet. Coat was on backwards. And I went out, and I did the groceries, and I did the Christmas tree, and I bought gas, all like that, because I thought, I'm totally screwed. And I came back, and she had sent me images of all the booths at the fair of all the years that they had had it. It was amazing that there was this archive. And as I looked through it, I noticed that in the center of each one of these things was a modernist table where the deal was made in the center of each one of these booths. And a lot of them were the tulip table, which I had always been fascinated with.
Kind of a classic art fair fixture almost.
Yeah. And so that was, so then the idea just really gelled, all the different things that I previously had wanted to do in my proposal, but they were perhaps too surrealist, too old. It combined with this modernist object, and that's how those ideas come about.
You mentioned your experience with the family chicken earlier, and there's an interest in design that runs throughout your work. Is that why? That you had tactile experience with functional design as a child, and that's maybe fed into why Saarinen and Bertoia and others make it into the work?
Perhaps.
I mean, a lot of artists resist design references.
Yeah.
Like, really ardently resist design references.
Well, I'd say actually mine comes from a more archetypal, conceptual discovery that I made early on in my work, which was this objectness that when I was making work, I'm almost under a spell. When I put an object on the floor, I think it's almost done, in a sense, because I've already used the most powerful thing, that strange art objectness that you can say, here it is, here's a thing. It's apart from everything else. And since that art category is so mystically strange and confusing, that power is all the more there. But what I found in looking at how that engagement between the viewer before the object went, I started to look at the human and say, okay, so the human has all this efficientness. Its feet are on the floor that hold its legs, and the leg bone's connected to the hip bone. And eventually you get up to consciousness. And in consciousness, you have all kinds of things at play that change. So he's looking at structures in my sculptures where an efficientness, like the table base, brings everything up efficiently and then becomes amorphous and things move into play. So like in 100 pounds of clay, each one of those little shelves is actually really key for me. It's an efficient means of presenting something that we don't necessarily know something about. How to be articulate and yet have things be open and unknown.
That kind of sounds like another way of saying something you told Andrew Weiner in Bomb Magazine on the occasion of that tulip table exhibition, and it's one of kind of the all-time great artist quotes. You said, quote, I'm finding it very difficult to make works that aren't so good looking.
Mm.
Can you unpack what that means a little bit? Because it's a great idea.
Yeah. Well,
it's a very art teacher idea. It's a very college professor.
I'll say that my best pieces often involve a break in time. I'll go, like say, on a trip. I'll come back to the studio. I'll be looking at a piece that I was really struggling with, but I thought I really had it. And the simplest thing, I just go up and I just take one part off and throw it on the ground next to it, let it flop over, let it hang, and I go, that's more like it. The space that opened up from removing that thing and the way that it hung there, I said, that's life. I can't actually sometimes make it directly because I'm too well-wishing for things. I want things to work out. Obviously, we want them to work out, and when we're making work, we want that. But in fact, the thing that we can do in art that in few other areas in life are possible, we can bring impasse, we can bring inconclusion, we can bring destruction, we can bring chaos, we can bring paradox, we can bring these things forward, and it's tolerable and actually also really healing. But you can't quite do that in entertainment. You can't quite do that in architecture. I mean, people do, and those are really interesting. It's very, very interesting when they do. And when they do, it tends to be more like art.
I want to switch to talking about a group of sculptures you made that have come to be known either through something you said or not as the bird-dropping sculptures. Was that your phrase, or did somebody else come up with that?
There's all kinds of words. Sometimes, yeah, four-letter words.
Yeah. Yes, those too. So before I ask you about them, could you introduce them by describing kind of what they are and how they were made?
Right. Well, they were the last body of work I made in the 5-year period that I had a studio that was located on the edge of the LA River, which was basically a kind of, moving dump through the city.
Through a concrete channel.
Yeah. But in my section of LA, it was called Frogtown by the gangs there. What happened was the aquifer burst through that concrete channel, and that breaking of the concrete allowed trees and things to grow, which then would collect shopping carts as those got flooded into them, and then the shopping carts would act as trellises, and then islands would get built. And now there's like 125 different species of birds that visit that 8-mile stretch.
Wow.
And I was very fortunate to find myself there, and it was... And so when I first started working there, the work was more enchanted and also still apocalyptic. I was taking stuff from the river to the studio, making it, bring it back down to the river.
Physically taking it.
Yeah, rescuing these sort of weird things out of it, and then sort of glomming them all together with paint and plaster to make that wholeness. But it was about 2006, 2007, and we were going back into Iraq again. The real estate market was getting overheated. I was being pushed out of my studio because real estate was going crazy. The neighborhood was being gentrified. And my view of the river really changed, and I saw it in much more stark view. And it got pared down to one aspect of the river, and it was these stains of white that cascade down the slopes of the concrete. And I didn't know what they were, and I probably wouldn't have even thought much about them, but I thought that they looked like Giacometti sculptures. And Giacometti's always been incredibly important to me, especially the way that, say, his careers can be divided into the sort of early surrealist and then this later part, which one can view as sort of about the core of a human, but also could be about absolute, inhumanity at the same time. And I was, at this point, moving into that part of his career in my own sort of parallel mythology. There's always a picture of Giacometti up in my studio. He's really key for me. And so I started photographing these things, and then I realized that they were bird excrement from the great blue herons, which are enormous birds. And they eat the invasive species of Asian carp that's in the river. Oh. And then they excrete it on the banks, and it makes these forms that look like birds or people. And I would take all the garbage that I would normally have made larger sculptures out of, but I would just take all the bits and pieces of plastic and paper and metal and mix them with paper mache and put them on a steel armature and make three-dimensional versions of those bird shit stains. You know, for me, there was it was sort of a polymorphous perversity where the bird was the artist, I was nothing, humans were nothing. It was almost a kind of more of a force of nature, and it was a way perhaps of taking the things that I thought were bad, like war and, you know, the economy, things that were causing social distress, and taking a sort of more zoomed out look at them and accepting them and wanting to present it for good or bad. You know, it's these images that these sculptures and photographs make are both elegant and have a kind of soberness that's refreshing. And then there's also a kind of apocalyptic devastation and emaciatedness.
Because, you know, I think people often forget that a lot of those Giacomettis, those gaunt walking men, you know, are made after a world war in which gaunt walking men were part of the European social urban landscape. And so then you make these pieces which very much refer to an American post-industrial, post-manufactured landscape. And I wonder if that relationship between Europe after its second of two major world wars and America after its industrialization, if that relationship was really important.
It's super important. You know, I was an East Coaster up until 2002 when I came out to California to teach. And it was right after 9/11. My studio was in Chelsea, and that was a period in my life as well when I was really sort of removing myself from the art world. I'd actually it sort of halted my studio practice indefinitely and thought that teaching would be a better place for me. I was really I was sort of in a deep search for meaning, and one of the books that I was reading at that time when I went to California with like 13 boxes, some of them containing just little monad sculptures, which paralleled my own mythology about Giacometti fleeing over the Alps with the little figures in a matchbox in his pocket. So I was reading this book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which is a book that he began work on while he was in Dachau and Auschwitz. And in his book, what he wanted to do was he wanted to say, okay, here I am in a place that just seems like there's just absolutely nothing good. And he said, how can I find meaning in it? And I just found that so compelling and like perfect material for my own research in life. Where do you find it? And I tend to strip everything away periodically. I'd probably say every 10 years. And I think I'm really at that moment right now where I want to take everything away and start over because I want to get to a core. I'm so fascinated with, you know, difference and a kind of celebratory dystopia, these different things, but it gets out of hand. And then I want to ask these questions. Well, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? And so the work that I began when I started working once again in California, a lot of it came out of Viktor Frankl's book and also Primo Levi's periodic table.
You're showing here at the Nasher while we're talking a piece called The Third Person from 2003. Is this piece related to what you're...
The title, in fact, comes from Man's Search for Meaning. It was randomly pulled out. The titles of all the work then were randomly pulled out of the book, or some were paraphrased. Let's see, there was Soundly Through the Noise, which referred, I think it came out of a context where he was talking about how strange it was in the camp that people who had normally been light sleepers, would be sleeping 2 or 3 people in a bunk with all this chaos, and they'd sleep soundly through the noise. But taking out of context, it had another meaning for me about sort of arriving, in California safely through the noise, that things were still okay, that there's a resilience to things, even if you strip everything away. The third person was a kind of mysterious figure. It's not me, it's not you, it's this other. So I was interested in those things. Another piece, The Slave Chemist, that was a sort of paraphrase of who Primo Levi was, who was a chemist who the Nazis kept alive because they were going to use him to help make, bombs and things with chemicals.
We've talked about a number of pieces that have just these kind of wide-ranging forms, and the third person is one that, if we'd looked at 10 other works before we looked at that one, that we wouldn't necessarily identify that one as a Charles Long. Were you looking at more in Hepworth? What were you?
Oh, I'm always looking at all that stuff,
So you're a big believer in the big soup.
Yeah, well, it's also funny that in my early work in the, say, late 80s, early 90s, I was making things and people would tell me, they'd say, hey, do you know the work of Seymour Lipton? Or do you know Ibram Lassaw or Herbert Ferber or Theodore Rozak? They would name all these American sculptors that had actually been celebrated in all the Whitney biennials when they used to be alternate years of painting and sculpture. And I didn't know that work, but I was intuitively making this kind of chaotic post-World War II surrealism. And so when I'm working with all these different kinds of forms, it's not always that I'm looking at it first and then making the form. It's almost like I discover the history of sculpture and form through the work.
So one of the many museums do this thing where they invite in artists and ask them to pull things out of the collection and install them. And they're often some of the most interesting things museums do because curators have very different eyes and different reasons for showing things than artists did. And in 2006, you did this at the Hirshhorn as part of a show called The Uncertainty of Objects, and they asked you to pull some stuff out. And I wonder if any of the things that you pulled out have particularly stuck with you and then found their way into things you've made.
They have, and there were a lot of people that I probably won't even remember the names of. I'm always...
That was, I remember, I looked up the checklist actually last week, and you pulled out a couple Ken Prices, but other than that, the obscurity was pronounced.
Yeah, and that's because it's just, I don't know if history's written by the winners or what, but I find all these people that have, dedicated their lives into form and meaning so interesting. So to be able to pick through their collection, literally, climbing around on the shelves and, holding, like, Medardo Rosso in my hands. It was an incredible experience. But yeah, and I actually do take things from those works, complex or simple little devices that I saw, that I assume maybe, it's part of a language maybe they were pulling from too.
Because almost if you flipped Fountainhead totally upside down, it's almost like a Ken Price shape in progress. It's bulbous and flowing, and it's not a Ken Price, but it does have kind of an organicness to it that is really pronounced. Mm-hmm. That's really. You mentioned a couple times that you're a teacher. You teach at the University of California at Riverside. And so to entertain myself a couple nights ago, I logged on to a website called ratemyprofessors.com to to see what your students thought of you. And the comments were kind of astonishingly consistent. I think 11 of the 12 comments mentioned how funny you are. Oh. which I think really comes...
I never go to that site.
No, I think professors don't.
You do not go there if you're a professor, if you want to keep going.
But I thought that was interesting because I think a sense of humor really does come through a lot of the work. Fountainhead says lots of very serious things about commerce and charity and engaging with each and the conflicts of having both in the same space. But there's a real puckishness to digitally throwing a coin at an inanimate object with a projection on it, and I don't know, it's both fun and funny. And I wonder if you were always willing to make the sense of humor that your students obviously find in the classroom on a day-to-day basis, if you were always willing to have that in the work, or if it took a while to be comfortable with that.
Well, it's funny, I think the humor became a part of the work when I had discovered Freud's book, Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious, which I read very early on in like 1980. And soon after, tried to do stand-up for a little while.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah, in the East Village clubs.
Oh, wow. How'd that go?
Not so good. I couldn't handle it. My stomach, just getting knots before it. But I like the unpredictability of comedy and pressure. And as Freud talked a lot about in that book, there's that repressed thing. I mean, all the way to the body itself. He said that the laughter is already in the body, and it just can't wait to get out. And it's the social pressure that then is setting the case for laughter to come out of that. And then, of course, he points out that the jokes often then have a connection to something that is maybe not so socially appropriate. And so I think those things have always intrigued me. But even in a more subtle way, it's the way that jokes bend things, that a meaning flips over and becomes something else. And you don't even necessarily know all the possible meanings of some sort of humorous aspect. So I think for me, in the same way, also music's such a huge part of my life. When I lecture on my work, I DJ it while I show the slides. In my class, I like to have music. In a similar way, that music is this thing that seems to not be accountable fully in a rational way. And the same with the joke. The joke is an articulation, but that articulation remains kind of fraught with possible explosions and collapses and reversals and paradoxes.
I didn't know you did stand-up comedy, but I now wonder, so a couple years ago, you did a text piece for the catalog of a Hammer Museum show called All of This and Nothing. And parts of it are very art teacher, and parts of it, well, here's one of the things that was in that text piece. I saw a commercial on late night TV. It said, "Forget everything you know about slipcovers." So I did, and it was a load off of my mind. Do you know the rest of this? Then the commercial tried to sell me slipcovers, and I didn't know what the hell they are.
Right. Now the thing about that project was I was fooling around with creating a text where you wouldn't know who was saying what.
And the way it was designed, is that the right word, on the page furthers that idea. It's
right. The texts were only identified by being in a slightly different shade of green.
Right.
And then you could go to a key and match it, but since the shades were so close, you wouldn't necessarily know who it was attributed to.
And you wouldn't know to do that, and I think until the end of the...
Right. So it was a kind of a peculiar experiment. But yeah, that's a good one.
Is that the only text piece you've done?
No, I've done a lot of them, and I'm actually working on some right now in the studio. Right now, I'm growing these sort of stalagmites. I've collected over the years all these medallions from automobiles that are the names. So they say things like, you know, Bobcat, Cougar, Swinger, Caprice, Royale. Some of them have interesting sort of colonialist kind of associations, you know, Estate, Lincoln. And I'm pushing them into clay, and it's making a void, and I'm casting that void. And then I'm taking that cast, and I'm pushing that through clay, and so on, and they stack up and make these stalagmites with the word at the top. But the word, since it was in profile, extends down, and so that at the bottom, it's a distortion of that word, like a quite a distortion. So I'm interested in that text becoming a thing, a text having physical implications in reality and echoing outward and becoming something.
Does that descend from your stand-up experience? Or is that from teaching? Or is that, it's a very particular way of using symbols and words?
Well, you know, there was a piece I did, it was the piece for me that put everything in order, and it was a piece I did in 1987 to 89. It took 2 years to make. And this piece is called Special, and it's a rock that has about 500 mirror facets on it. And it looks like a kind of geode, like a Star Trek prop, and it sits under a spotlight. But each one of those mirror facets is actually angled in a really precise way so that when light hits it, it reflects onto the wall and organizes it into the word special that is over top of it. So this was a piece for me that really, you know, sorted out this issue of language and the object. If you turned the rock, the word would just distort into a mirror ball, and you just have little dots all around the ceiling. But then once you realigned it, the word would congeal again. And what I was interested in after 2 years of working on it was actually how the piece felt to me with the light off. Because with the light off, no reflections, there's a shape to that rock that is specific and means something somehow. And yet it looks chaotic. It just looks like, you know, some natural thing. But that it held that, and I knew the difference. And so that's really was sort of this paradox that I was able to base every subsequent work on, comes out of that experience. It was turning the light off and saying, this work, even though it seems completely chaotic and amorphous and non-signifying, its specificity has, it's a finite specificity. It will never change in a way, and that compels me. It puts me in the world in a way that is, you know, you can easily sort of sum it up and say a state of wonder. So I have a word for it, but the true experience is much stranger and profound, and I really love that experience.
You said a few minutes ago that about every 10 years you kind of shed your coat and head in a different direction. And Fountainhead reveals a particular interest in social practice and in a clever, smart, funny way, in a neat context. And I'm guessing that what you've done in Fountainhead is, in your mind, related to what you're doing in Austin next year. And so I guess for that to make sense, first we need to know what you're doing in Austin next year. It's a very large thing. It's a large project, and it's all based on a tiny piece of plastic. It's a very small 6-inch rod of something called Catalin, which was a plastic from invented maybe in the 1920s. And it was probably the third plastic. There was celluloid, bakelite, and then comes Catalin. But the project is really about a kind of dark vision of the future and even the present
And Fountainhead, you may pick up on, there's some kinds of 1930s motifs. I mean, there's the Ayn Rand reference, but there's also, if you look at the surface of the rock, there's a lot of sort of Art Deco kind of flourishes embedded in it.
And if you look at the title plate or whatever you call it, flourishes on that, or on the kiosks, flourishes to those physical things too.
Right, and the dollar bill itself even, I think,
like
contains
a silver
that.
dollar with the, was it the winged?
Yeah, Liberty.
Right.
And then even the dollar bill, the sort of filigree on it. So I'm interested in this moment coming out of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is really the beginning of what geologists call the Anthropocene period, where we are now altering the Earth forever. And this connects what I was talking about in terms of specificity, that we think things are just sort of strange and always unfolding and surprising, but they actually always have consequence. So the littlest thing has consequence and goes forward. So every bit of carbon that we've brought up from under the earth is going to be going on forever. And every bit of plastic we've ever made, other than the ones that have been burned, will essentially still be around. It's a kind of molecule that's not going to disappear. It's going to break down. All the plastic that's going into the ocean is going to stay there. It's not going to go out. It's just going to get smaller. And all the carbon that we're putting in that's changing the climate, that just continues to go forward. We're already living in it. It already happened. And it's going forward. And so we're in a kind of limbo where we enjoy this incredible type of standard of living and freedom, and yet we're becoming aware of the consequences and what it means in a very long term. And actually, it's strange, that long term's getting shorter. It used to seem like, oh, wow, that's really far away. Now we're talking about a sea level rise that potentially could displace the entire population of the United States, but spread out over the world within my son's lifetime, and that's very intense. So the project in Austin, I'm working with glaciologists, perfumers, philosopher. I'm growing a crypt that is huge, an architectural crypt that has a lot of Art Deco motifs, and it's all made out of mushrooms, which I'm working with a company called Ecovative, and they are coming up with an alternative to styrofoam, one of the things that's the least destructible plastics in the environment. And so they've come up with this way of growing styrofoam using mycelium. So for me, the mycelium is also this sort of giant organism. I mean, it is the world's, or the largest known living organism. It's up in Oregon. And
it's 4.5 miles.
Yeah,
long or wide or whatever you.
So I'm interested in the kind of how, I think the positive thing about all the research that's gone into doing the project in Austin, which has been very disheartening and has had me, I've had some really bleak days when I learn about how fast the glaciers are disappearing. The positive thing about it is that this is giving us an opportunity to actually really learn about the Earth and really learn about what being is. Like, we're going to have to look at how there are consequences to every action. It's mind-blowing.
To that point, the piece will be at Art House. One of the rooms in Art House references both perfume and glaciation, and maybe a good way to describe that point you're explaining is to explain that part of the piece.
Right. So that building's history, the ground floor was a department store. The upstairs was used as a theater in the 20s, Art Deco, and still you see some of the motifs there. So on the ground floor from the street, you can look in and you'll see all these beautiful forms are actually printed in a biodegradable plastic. And they look like icebergs, and they are perfume dispensers, which we've created perfumes using water from glaciers, but a lot of botanicals for the scents. And the forms of the so-called icebergs are actually based on collections of data, like how many Lego bricks are created every year,
How many iPhones are bought every year?
Yeah, some of the factors seem relevant to issues about environment. Others seem strange, like student loan debt or car accidents, things like that. They seem like, well, what does that have to do with it? And that's purposeful. In fact, I'm looking at a kind of clash of things where the perfume is like, who's got anything against perfume, right? Like, it didn't hurt anybody. But that it's glacier water, even if it's just drops of it in there that you're putting on, it's almost a kind of ritualistic kind of blood of the earth that you're
a confrontation with the thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, an intimacy. That's right. The thing. There's an intimacy that's happening through this project. For me, as I discover these tiny bits of plastic in the ocean, or these strange data fields. So there's an intimacy, and there's a luxury, which is nothing wrong with luxury inherently. But how does it play against consequence? So, and so when do we be serious and take everything very seriously? And when is it something we can sort of stay in our dream a little longer? Or maybe it's right to stay in the dream. And these are the questions. I mean, that's why the Holocaust is as interesting to me as bubblegum. I'm really interested in the trivial and the catastrophic, and I definitely see them as connected, and I'm interested in connecting them. So the perfumes are actually, there's 7 of them, and each one has a name, and its name begins with one of the letters of the word Catalan. So I think presently it's casually altering today's atmosphere, living ironically now. Those are the 7 perfume scents. So I think I'm not at all comfortable with this project. I'm very uncomfortable with it because I don't want to be living ironically. I don't want to be cynical. But I realize that I live in such a hypocritical state that I want to expose it, and I want to suffer a little for it. I want to be uncomfortable, and I want to make people uncomfortable. At the same time, I'm also offering alternatives out, and that's where, like working with this company that's developing this new replacement for styrofoam using mushrooms, there's hope moving forward.
One of the interesting things in art at the moment to me is seeing so many artists trying to find ways of addressing climate change, which is a massive thing, in artworks that are individual and specific, and it's something more and more artists are doing, and it's an interesting area. Let's open it up for questions. If anybody has, we don't have microphones or anything like that, so if you have a question, raise your hand and then belt it out. Anyone? Anybody? Yes.
You speak very engagingly about the intellectual part of your artistic work. How about the physical? Have you ever encountered difficulties of craft which limited you in putting your interesting ideas and concepts into sculptural practice?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, I kind of feel like that's the secret horror of being a sculptor. That's just the ongoing nastiness of it, a real craftsperson, like a really good craftsperson, knows their material and gets to know, like, well, this wood is going to do this, so I can't treat it this way. I'm going to work with it this way, I'll push it as far as I can. We were talking about Ken Price. Ken, he would make those geometric forms, and when he would talk about it, he'd say, "Oh gosh!" And then I went back into making those hard-edged, ceramic forms. They were such a pain. So a good craftsperson balances those. I, on the other hand, like to completely jump into a new material all the time. So, my last show in New York was made out of a thing called ecopoxy. It was so hard to pull off.
I have a list of materials you've used in the last decade.
Okay.
Stoneware, steel, paper mache, plaster, river sediment, which I think is euphemistic, lacquer, ecopoxy, fiberglass, used with many of these things, also acrylic paint and audio.
Yeah, and don't forget things like a single hair from Abraham Lincoln's head.
I did miss that one.
Coffee grounds. I made a whole show out of coffee grounds.
No, that's right.
I believe that meaning is in the materials too. It's not the shape, and it's not the sort of symbolic. It's not there are all those things, but the actual like molecular things that are going on, that fascinates me. So when people see this project in Austin, they're going to just see this big architectural monument, but it's a mushroom. I really enjoy that. It was a living organism.
Do you start with the material, or do you start with something else?
Again, it's that whole
it's never one
floating thing.
You're out on a walk on the mountain.
That's right. What led me to the coffee grounds, for instance, was I did it in '97 as a reaction to the sort of pop plastic stuff I did. I was like, what can I do that's more like poop? I wanted to...
Common question.
Yeah. I wanted, it was like the public was eating up the candy, and I was like, well, what happens if I, misbehave here? How can I do that? And I knew that it had to, and then I just went into that world, and slowly I realized, oh, it's coffee. It's this material, it's this drug that we use that excites the consciousness. It sometimes produces a bowel movement even. So there was a physicality of this and change of consciousness that attracted me. And so I started collecting coffee grounds from all over New York City. And in a sense, they were all decaffeinated, right? They'd been used. So, I was making these poops that were sculptures that people had to drink the coffee that was served at the show to figure out what was going on inside. So it's a whole, materiality and learning it is a really important part.
But you've also used very traditional materials like stoneware. Mm-hmm. And there's an intentionality to stoneware. If you're going to use stoneware, you have to kind of start with the material. Why? So why stoneware? What about stoneware was something you wanted to do at that moment in 2006? That
was in one of my getting back to the earth kind of moments.
And maybe
and that's where I'm at now. I mean, once I finished with the Austin project, once that's finished, I'll probably want to work in just bronze and clay. I think I'd like to clear away a lot of the ideas and possibilities. There's something, you can see from all the things we've talked about, and we could have talked about so many other things, that it feels almost out of control. It feels like too many things. How can I bring this all down and be stuck with the silence, in the studio?
Yeah, Fountainhead is a really distilling piece. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes?
You said that you moved to California in search of a new direction, and your new direction included teaching. Could you speak a little bit about how you have found teaching art, and how that, and you also said that you started work again. So does the teaching and doing the work have its own magic for you?
Thanks for that question. It's great. Yeah, in the same way that I don't like to use the same material twice, it's hard to teach the same material twice. And even when I do, I have to take a whole new take on it. So the process of teaching is producing ideas. For instance, even in the bird poop pieces, I was in the middle of class when I came up with the idea of making the photographs using the old method of albumin photography, which uses egg whites to capture the image. So that I was interested in, I can take an image of bird poop and make it out of bird eggs. But I was right in the middle of, a lecture, and I was showing these albumin photographs, and bam, the light bulb went off. So I get a lot of my ideas from it, and I guess also, as I was even telling my students last week, I have to then walk the talk. So I'll say these big things in class, and then I'm in the studio and I'm like, whoa, am I fooling myself? I have to go back and you know, really do what I say. So I get a lot from it. I hope I give a lot to it. And you know, it's also, there's so many different parts of the art world, and a lot of times we focus on things like, say, art fairs or magazines or biennials or things like that. And I guess you could say that's at the top of the food chain. That's like the giant, you know, organism that eats all the little stuff. But just learning about art, you know, it's not, we're not teaching art to make people into future biennialists and people that will make things for art fairs. There's something right there in that moment. And it's complete right there at times. That's why, you know, I'm at a research institution. I'm very fortunate to be at a specific place where we're actually encouraged to research and take chances in front of the students.
Others? Yes.
One, I think a through line in your work has also been music. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Wow. Well, one of the things about it is that, in a strange way, it's how I get to appreciate art. I love sculpture and I love painting, but you know, contemporary art is work for me to look at, and so I don't actually look at it as much anymore. I mean, when I lived in New York, I saw every show all the time. But that weighs on you. There's something there there's a lot of baggage with it for me. And music is not like that for me. And it's something I can afford, I can collect, and I can share really easily. And so it's been the thing that I collect. You know, my home doesn't have a lot of art in it, but my collection, my music collection is enormous. And I think then also I disappear into music. There's a way in which I get so excited by it that it takes over. And that's also how many of my shows are really grounded in that. They start off with certain things. For instance, the whole Austin project really comes out of a song called Art Decade by David Bowie on the B-side of the Low album, and also an album by Harold Budd called Luxa. And those albums will just get into my head, and I'll just be in it, and I sleep it, I hear it in my sleep, and I get up, and I'm inside this world. And so then the work is almost creating itself from within. So it just doesn't have any of the baggage for me of ego that the art world seems to have. I have less. It doesn't take anything away, and it just soaks me in a certain kind of presence.
You played the piano as a young man for about 8 years. Were you good at it? And does that experience still feed into anything?
I didn't.
Oh, you didn't? It was in the Hammer. It's in the Hammer. It's in the Hammer text piece.
It's a joke.
Oh, it's a joke. So you never did play the piano. Ah.
See, someone else said that.
Anyone else? Yes.
Do you feel that technology is playing a large part in that you're incorporating it into your work these days?
Unfortunately, yes.
Why unfortunately?
Because there's just too much technology in my life already. I didn't realize that having it in my art was going to make my life kind of a drag, and it has. Because it's also when I work on these projects that are so big and involve so many different people and problems, there's so much emailing, and there's so much image sorting and uploading and downloading. And this summer, I have a show up in Berlin right now, and I was making some drawings for it this summer, and it was a real change for me to be able to do something, just me, no assistant, no emailing, and it was the strangest thing. I had my hand with the pastel in it up against the paper, and I was like, shit, like my eyes are getting an email of photons of pink coming out of this pastel on this green paper. And, you know, it was like I realized there was the same thing, but it was happening right there. And I didn't know where that hand would go next and what it would put on the paper. And it was all right there, self-contained, nothing more. And there was nothing to say about the work afterwards. It was just itself. And I said, there's hope. After Fountainhead, after Austin, after Berlin, there's me and clay and wax and bronze and plaster in the studio.
The technological thing of the coin going up into the fountain is kind of cool.
Huge pain.
I was gonna. was that your idea, and then you tell some young man who's very good with software to do it? Yeah.
Hey, Emery, thank you. Hey, hey, Kirsten, the two of them, they worked wonders. That is what's fun for me, is to collaborate with younger artists who are good at that. It's wonderful. But even so, it's still, then I have to learn about some of it, and I'm not interested at all. And, you know, it's like we can, you know, these sort of dazzling artworks, I don't know, there's also a kind of vanity to them, you know? And I think, can we get away with something very simple? Is that sufficient after so much spectacularness? Can we dial it back?
Charles Long, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you all. Thanks, Tyler.